So we've been talking about how America is going to be an empire over the last couple of days, right? Day one, we talked about what makes a country an empire, what makes a country imperialist. Day two, yesterday, we talked about how America pursues that with the Spanish-American War. Day three, today, we're going to take a look at how we pursue empire in Asia. What are the things that we do in Asia to pursue empire? So let's set the stage, right? The first thing we need to talk about probably is the biggest country in Asia, and that's China. And we purchase, or I should say rather, China at the time purchases the least amount of goods from us. They're the biggest country in the world. They buy the least from us, not much at all. So we want to change that, right? Remember that part of imperialism is finding new markets to sell your products. At the same time, China also has a weak military. Well, so they don't buy a lot of goods from us, and they have a weak military. It seems like this is something we might want to get in on. The problem is other nations already are. Because China has a weak military, Japan and Russia had been kind of fighting back and forth over 10 or 15 years worth of time during this age of imperialism to try and get influence in China. In fact, Russia even demands that China should give it land and that China should lease land to it. And really, you should know that Russia and Japan aren't the only countries looking for influence in China. There's Germany and Britain and Austria and the French and Italy. All these different countries are looking for influence in China. And they want to establish something called a sphere of influence. Now, you know what a sphere is, right? It's like a ball, an area, right? It's a sphere, a place that exists. And you know what influence is? When you influence someone, you encourage them to do something. You can influence somebody. So a sphere of influence is an area in a country where you can control or influence the economy of that country. You can control economic development inside that country. And all of these other countries that want to get involved, right? Russia, Japan, Britain, France, Austria, Italy, etc., they all have spheres of influence in China. But the country that's off in the distance, the country that's away from everything, the country that doesn't have a sphere of influence, that's us. And we want to change that. But we're also worried about what would happen if all of these nations competing for spheres of influence that have empires all over the world, what would happen if they get into a fight over China? We want to make sure that everybody gets access to China and that nobody goes to war. So we have to come up with an idea for this. How can we get a sphere of influence in China? How can we make sure everybody else gets a sphere of influence in China and no one feels the need to go to war over it? Well, what we do is we come up with this idea called the open door policy. And President McKinley says that everyone, including America, should have access to China's markets. And he sends this to the leaders of Italy and Austria and Britain and France and Russia and all these other places. And he says to them, here's the policy. And each one of them writes back and says, we'll do it if everyone else does it, but don't tell the other nations that we'll do it. Just tell us if everyone says they'll do it. And everyone does agree. Funny though, there's one country they didn't ask. They didn't ask China. They didn't ask China if it would be okay with making sure all the other major imperial powers in the world would have access to that country's markets and spheres of influence. And that really makes the Chinese angry. As you would imagine, right? If another country came to America and said to us that all the other major nations of the world would have economic influence over us without asking us, we'd be pretty angry. So the Chinese, furious over this loss of control, create this secret society. They call it the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists. Their nickname is the Boxers. And they're determined to destroy foreign influence. And for a little while, they win. They're winning. And they go after foreigners. They killed several hundred of them. They kill Christian missionaries, anyone that they perceive as a foreigner bringing outside ways to China. But if you think that America and all these other countries, which just signed off on the open door policy, are going to give up their spheres of influence, you're crazy. These other countries, all of them, instead of going to fight each other at war, they unite and they go to China and crush the rebellion together. All of this is happening in the very early 1900s, just after we complete the Spanish-American War. But something kind of changes the way America will look at the world. All of this work we've been doing in China comes from President McKinley. Problem is, McKinley's shot in early 1904, he's shot. And his vice president, Teddy Roosevelt, becomes president. Now, Teddy Roosevelt says, you know what we need to do? We need to influence less civilized societies. We need a strong military to show the world how strong we are. And so Roosevelt says that, you know what we're going to do? We're going to continue with what McKinley wants to do. We're going to try and prevent any one nation from controlling all trade in China. So when two nations do get into a fight over it, Russia and Japan, he is able to negotiate a resolution to that war and to that fight over spheres of influence. And what Roosevelt is attempting to do here is show our power, that here we are, mighty America, and that we, who have come up with the open door policy, we can step into this and we can say, Japan, Russia, you don't need to do this. Stop fighting. And they'll listen to us. That shows that we've got the power. So Roosevelt, realizing how successful he was with this, starts to build on his ideas. He looks for other places around the world where he can show American strength and that America was powerful. Comes up with the canal through Central America. He says, wait a minute, if we build a canal that connects this half of the world with this half of the world, it would save time and money for anyone who wants to ship goods from one side of the world to the other, and it would allow our Navy to move from one side of the world to the other. He says that this is a vital, vital project for American world power. And it's a disaster to start. The French had been trying to do this for 10 years and they couldn't do it. It was a disaster. Disease was killing everyone. It had completely slowed progress because of disease. But Americans came in and they figured out ways to stop the disease, ways to build a canal. Something like this had never been done before. They were inventing machines on the spot to build this canal. And when it works, it connects the world. I understand that. Teddy Roosevelt was able to motivate people to connect two sides of the world. We dug a hole through the earth large enough to connect the world. That's a really big deal, and it shows people how technologically powerful we are as well. Teddy Roosevelt, looking at all of his work in China, Asia, looking at his work in Panama with the Panama Canal, says that, you know what our philosophy should be? It should be to speak softly and carry a big stick. It should be this idea that we can display our power to the world and stop nations from fighting. That we say to you, if you don't knock this off, you wait until I get home, and I swear to God, we'll have words. That's what speak softly and carry a big stick means, because people will stop fighting. Roosevelt even does this here in our half of the world. He calls it the Roosevelt Corollary. He says that America will get involved, it'll intervene in Latin American countries and Latin American affairs when necessary to protect our interests there, our business investments there. We own and will protect this half of the world. And other presidents that come after Roosevelt agree with him. Guys like William Howard Taft, for instance, the president after Roosevelt, says, you know what? We're not just going to speak softly and carry a big stick. We're going to use something called dollar diplomacy. We're going to give those countries in Latin America money. We're going to make it rain on Latin American industry in order to get those Latin American nations up out of poverty and disorder so that they can be our allies. Woodrow Wilson comes along after Taft does and says, you know what, we're going to use moral diplomacy around the world. We're going to do what's right in other countries. We're going to navigate the crazy waters between war and the economy and violence and disaster. And we're going to make sure that even though foreign policy and foreign affairs absorb a lot of his time and energy as president, that we're going to do what's right around the world. Example of this is a general, a guy named Huerta, seizes power in Mexico in 1910. And Wilson says that, you know what, if you want us to recognize you, you can only establish a government based on law. Otherwise, we're not going to recognize you. These are all examples of how the United States will use its power, not just in Asia, but around the world, to show that we are important and that we are great. We are an imperial country.